talking about healthcare. And Stephen, if you want something to take to the conference tomorrow, I've got the thing for you. You coming in at that moment was an act of God, and everything's going to turn out well. And this is the story. Oh, how do you change the slide? If I spoke too soon, things turning out well. Just on this, right? Okay. So many years ago, I used to be a junior hospital doctor working in an intensive care unit like this, and I really got interested in road safety after I killed an 11-year-old girl. And so basically, I was a junior hospital doctor working in a hospital, and there was in New Zealand. And there was a high-speed road crash north of Auckland. So two cars hit each other head-on. The mother and father sitting in the front seat died immediately, but the 11-year-old daughter sitting on the back seat had a lap belt on. She was sitting in the middle. She had this lap belt on, and with the impact, the lap belt saved her going through the windscreen, but she kind of slid under the lap belt, and it kind of ruptured lots of her internal organs. And so this 11-year-old girl ends up in the emergency department, and it's my job to look after her. And she's deathly pale, but fully conscious, because she didn't have a head injury. The lap belt stopped her having a head injury, but she's bleeding inside. And so my job was to sort of stabilize the airway, and so I had this little girl's head in my hands, and she said, "Am I going to be all right?" And I said, "Yes, I think we're going to be all right. We're going to put you to sleep, and then we're going to take you to the operating theatre, and we're going to mend the bleeding in your tummy, and then you're going to be all right." And so then I gave her an anaesthetic. I put her to sleep. We took her to the operating room. And about an hour later, I went to see how she's getting on. And she was dead. She died on the table. She exsanguinated on the operating table. And all of a sudden, I thought, my God, I killed her. I really did feel like I killed her, because I told her she was going to be all right. Then I gave her this anaesthetic to take away her consciousness, and she never got it back. So I had this very strong emotional reaction that I killed this little girl, but I thought that rationally I didn't kill her, but emotionally I felt like I had. It was like sort of putting an animal to sleep, it never wakes up. So that was a very sort of strong experience for me, and I had, I had children of my own. I had a little girl then, and so just very strong experience. Now the interesting thing is, I got very interested then in evidence for prevention, and I went off and did a PhD in epidemiology. But I realised evidence is not, epidemiology is not just about prevention. Evidence is about everything. There's evidence for prevention, there's evidence for treatment, and I started being interested in evidence for treatment. And then I realised that nearly all the things that I did to this 11-year-old girl have subsequently been shown in randomised trials to do more harm than good. The sorts of things that Matthew was talking about. High volume fluid resuscitation. So what we did when I was holding her airway, the other people were sticking large bore catheters in her arms, pumping in fluid really quickly. We were pumping in a fluid called hydroxyethyl starch. That's been subsequently shown in large randomized trials to worsen bleeding and cause renal failure. It's been banned. My God! So I had this interesting experience of feeling like I killed somebody, but not thinking that I had. Now I sort of stopped feeling like that I killed her, but believed I probably did. So that was my sort of birth into being interested in evidence. Because you can feel so wonderful about yourself when you're doing the wrong thing. You can just think you're on top of the world and you're doing completely the wrong thing. And that's in prevention, in treatment, in rehabilitation, whatever. So, intervention, evaluation. So it started, I think, with James Lind. James Lind was a surgeon on a sailing ship. You know, before, in the old days, we didn't used to go around in aeroplanes, we used to go in sailing ships. And sailing ships, going on long distance sailing journeys was very dangerous because after a long time at sea, you've got scurvy, really nasty disease. Your gums start to rot and all your teeth fall out. You know, all your collagen breaks down, and basically all the bits that hold your bones together, you know, all your bones and your joints, it all starts falling apart. It's awful. But James Lind wanted to see, there were all sorts of treatments proposed by experts, and James Lind had a big idea of evaluating them. And so this is his big contribution to science. He said, on the 20th of May, I took 12 patients in the scurvy on board the Salisbury at sea, and he organised them so you've got cases, the cases were similar severity, and they were housed in similar locations, and then he gave them different treatments. And these are the treatments. There was only 2 patients, 12 patients, 2 patients. It was a very small trial. Not randomised, but a controlled trial. And he randomised, and he allocated them to these different groups. You know, some of them are really, these are the cures that they thought were effective in those days. Like half a pint of seawater daily. Yeah, you know, it doesn't sound good. 2 oranges and a lemon daily. Anyway, after a fortnight, the winner was clearly evident. The ones who got the 2 oranges and a lemon had a remarkable recovery, and they were so well they could look after the people in the other groups who had died. So that's believed to be the first controlled trial. The next big breakthrough was this person, Austin Bradford Hill, who was a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, professor of medical statistics, although he never had a, strangely he didn't have a statistics degree. But his big idea was randomisation. So control group, have a control group was Lind's idea. Allocate people to the interventions by randomly was Austin Bradford Hill's idea, and this is the first ever randomised controlled trial. It's the Medical Research Council's streptomycin trial. So there was this, you know, pulmonary tuberculosis. There wasn't enough streptomycin to go around, so they did a trial. They randomly allocated people to get streptomycin or not. So this is the big idea about randomised controlled trials. I love them because it's such a simple idea. All other research designs are really complicated because you've got this problem of confounding. But the big idea with randomised trials is if you randomly allocate big numbers of people to get the treatment or not, the 2 groups will be the same apart from the treatment, so that any difference in the outcome you can say is due to the treatment. Now, I used to travel around the world doing randomised trials. I used to take my 12-year-old son with me. He could get it. He could teach randomised trials. You know, it's such a simple concept. But there's one other big idea that came along, I think, in randomised trials, and it's this. You've got to get rid of bias by proper random allocation. But random error is an error. So small trials can get the wrong answer just by chance. So actually, you've got to have a control group. You've got to randomly allocate, and you've got to do it big. So very simple messages. So that's what I kind of learned from epidemiology, and then I started to try and apply it. So this man's just been hit by a Toyota in Thailand, and he's got a head injury, and his head is expanding, his brain is expanding inside his skull. And if the pressure gets too high, the brain will just get shoved down the spinal canal and he'll die. And a lot of people thought that corticosteroids were an effective treatment because corticosteroids have been shown to reduce swelling in different situations. And they thought, well, the brain's swelling, corticosteroids reduce swelling. So lots of the world's neurosurgeons used to give corticosteroids. Half the world's neurosurgeons used to believe them strongly, half of them didn't think they were effective. So we decided to do a trial. And this is the first big trial that we did, and it's called the CRASH trial. And we randomly allocated people to have corticosteroids or not, Am I doing something wrong? The battery's going on. Okay. Thank you for saving the day. We randomly allocated people to get corticosteroids or not. I thought corticosteroids were going to be, I did the trial because we thought corticosteroids were going to be effective, and this is the result. So 5,000 patients in each group, 21% dead in the steroid group, 18% dead in the placebo group. You know, what would you want? Would you want corticosteroids or not? You know, you don't need to be very sophisticated in your statistics, do you? 21% dead is worse than 18% dead. So I'd prefer to be in the 18% group. So it was a really disappointing trial. It was my first big trial. I just thought, oh my God, that is so disappointing, but never can you have an experience that makes you more convinced of the need for proper evaluation. So then we moved on to randomized trials in bleeding. So this woman has been stabbed in the stomach. The paramedic sticks his hands in the air, doesn't know what to do. And we came across some evidence. I mean, when I say we, it was a big we of lots of people. We came across some evidence of this drug called tranexamic acid. It's not a new drug, it was an old drug, but it was initially used for women who had heavy menstrual periods or people who had bleeding in their mouth after tooth extraction. But surgeons had started using it in operations, and it dramatically reduced bleeding. It reduced bleeding reduced the need for blood transfusion by about a third, and it also reduced the risk of death in surgery. So this drug really seemed to, reduce bleeding. So what about traumatic bleeding? Like the my little girl at age 11 had. Would it have helped in patients with traumatic bleeding? So we did another big trial called CRASH-2. And it was a bigger trial. We randomly allocated 20,000 patients, 10,000 got tranexamic acid, 10,000 got placebo. And this time we had some good news. A highly statistically significant reduction in the risk of dying in the group that got tranexamic acid. And because it was a really big trial, we could look which group of patients did best. So we anticipated that early treatment would be more effective, and it definitely was. If you gave the treatment within the first hour, it was a really large reduction in the risk of death. 1/3 reduction in the risk of death. If you gave it late, it didn't seem to be any use and could even be harmful. I'm not sure about the late harm, but I'm sure about the early benefit. And there were no side effects. In fact, the things that you worry about when you give a drug that helps clotting is that it causes unwanted clotting, and there were less unwanted clotting side effects in the group in the group of tranexamic acid. And it was a big trial, and so we could look at because it was a big trial. But we didn't do it in the United States, and so people in the United States said, well, the results don't apply here. And we said, why? Because there weren't any Americans in the study. But everywhere else it works. It works in everyone except Americans. I don't believe that for one moment, but it comes to the arguments we were talking about this morning. What's the basis on which you generalize? You generalize, as Rune explained very nicely, based on the sort of your beliefs about the mechanism of action. I'm physiologically the same as an American. My blood coagulation doesn't know what my passport is. So anyway, it works everywhere. And these are, we had hospitals in high-income countries with all the posh stuff inside them. We had hospitals in low and middle-income countries. There was just a bed, sometimes 2 patients in the bed. It works everywhere the same. And it's highly cost-effective. It's really cheap. This is, it's not the most cost-effective treatment in all of public health. I think that's probably insecticide-treated bed nets. Insecticide-treated bed nets is probably the number one, well, that I know of. So if you had $1 million to spend and you wanted to save some life years, spend it on insecticide-treated bed nets first. And then if you've got any money left over, spend it on tranexamic acid for trauma. But it's one of the most cost-effective ways to save a life. It's much more cost-effective than antiretroviral treatment for HIV, which the HIV lobby, has done a very good job of making sure everybody gets it. But we've not done a very good job of making sure people get tranexamic acid for trauma. And what my big disappointment is how tribal the road safety community is, and how safety people only talk about prevention and they're not interested in healthcare. Healthcare, I think, has made a substantial reduction in the cost in the case fatality from road traffic crashes. This flat line that Kavi showed, I think it probably would have gone up because I suspect there's been a decline in case fatality over time. And it's largely, better healthcare can make a big difference. So it's a highly cost-effective treatment. Very conservative estimates suggest you could save about 128,000 lives per year. And that's only patients treated in hospital. If you could treat patients pre-hospital, you could save more than that. So after this trial, people started getting worried about, well, what about head injury? We had patients with kind of polytrauma. They had injuries everywhere. Some of them had head injuries and body injuries. Some of them just had body injuries. So there was a big question whether it works in isolated traumatic brain injury. So we crashed 3 trials, the trial of the same drug in isolated traumatic brain injury. I won't go into the results in great detail, but it's probably a little bit less effective in isolated traumatic brain injury. Patients who have a really severe brain injury bleed into their brain really quickly, and there's probably nothing you can do to save them. But those with more mild and moderate brain injuries, you can make a huge difference with tranexamic acid. It's safe, reduces head injury death, doesn't increase disability. Patients should be treated as soon as possible. And as Matthew said, other than tranexamic acid and painkillers, there's very little role for any drugs in a pre-hospital setting. But let's just make sure everybody gets tranexamic acid. Why can't ministers for road safety be interested in this? Why aren't they interested in this? If you want to reduce death on the roads, then all parts of the system matter. You want to do good prevention, but don't forget good treatment. Good treatment can make a big difference very cost effectively, because all of these patients funnel in to hospitals where all you've got to do is a single injection of a drug that costs £1, and you can reduce the risk of death from all causes by about 10%. Then we could make a huge difference globally just by doing this. And that's what we should do. Thank you very much.